What's a scary science fact that the public knows nothing about? Story 1. The original nuclear bombs leveled the cities they detonated over, yet are considered puny by today's standards. The most powerful nuclear bomb ever created, the Tsar Bomba, had an explosive yield 3,000 times more powerful than the original nuclear bombs, and its power was calculated to be more than 10 times the combined power of every single munition used in World War II. That includes every bullet fired, every grenade thrown, every artillery shell fired, every bomb dropped, and of course, the 2 nuclear bombs dropped. It was detonated 4 kilometers from the ground over the remote Severny Island, yet still destroyed towns within a couple of 100 kilometers of the blast, and broke windows as far away as Copenhagen, Denmark. The shockwave from the blast circled the globe 9 times. The plane that dropped it was given a 50-50 chance of survival, yet the bomb was originally designed to be twice as powerful. Story 2. Amongst the possible ways the universe can end, one is called the Big Chance. All of them are pretty bleak, but I'm singling this one for a reason. It is common knowledge that everything likes to stay in its lowest energy state. A ball falls or rolls down a slope if left on its own. We can derive all of the known physical laws by mathematically following the assumption that everything is lazy as hell, which we physicists like to term the least action principle to conceal that we are dumb. Anyway, the universe is in no way different. The universe likes to stay in the lowest possible energy state, which we call a vacuum. It is in a local minimum. Think of local minimum as a dip on a curvy tabletop in which a ball is sitting. If you shift the ball slightly, it will slide back to that position. But that local minimum may not be a global minimum, i.e. that dip may not be the deepest dip on the tabletop. The ball will be at a lower energy in the deepest dip. However, it cannot move from the current dip on its own, though it is higher than the deepest one, because there is a higher barrier that it cannot overcome. Or can it? There's something in quantum mechanics called quantum tunneling that allows a ball to phase through the barrier into the deeper hole. Similar is the case with the universe. We don't know if the current vacuum the universe is in is the true vacuum, i.e. the deepest hole, or it is a false vacuum, one of the shallower holes. There's a high probability that the current vacuum is a false vacuum, and it can start to tunnel into the true vacuum. All it would require is one particle, anywhere, to decay the lower energy state. Then it would create a true vacuum bubble that would then proceed to expand and engulf our universe, destroying everything we know as it is, and creating new laws of physics. All it takes is any one of those around 1,084 particles. That's 1 trillion particles present in the universe to decay at any point in time. The bubble expands at the speed of light, so we will never see it coming. The scary part? It may have already happened, and coming toward us. There is absolutely nothing we can do to stop it. Story 3. If your dog swims in a lake after receiving a spot-on flea treatment, it decimates the invertebrate population. A large dog swimming in 8 Olympic swimming pools worth of water soon after treatment will leach enough neurotoxin to kill 50% of the lake's invertebrate population within 48 hours. I say after, I mean relatively soon after, within, say, a day, to have an effect quite this devastating. The leaching does reduce over the month, but it's still there, and the effect of multiple dogs still allows for a terrible buildup of chemicals. Story 4. I only recently learned that when you get sunburned, the burn isn't because of skin cell damage. UV radiation damages the DNA. Then the skin cells decide to commit suicide and fall off so that the damaged DNA doesn't produce cancer. I'll never be mad at my skin peeling again. Story 5. Brain aneurysms can be completely unpredictable and can happen at any time in your life, no matter how healthy you are. A kid who I went to high school with at the age of 16 just did not wake up one morning, and his cause of death was a brain aneurysm. I lost my husband of 12 years, we were best friends for 20 years, to a sudden brain aneurysm. The last words to me were, "Hun, I feel dizzy," and bam, on the floor, dead. I did CPR for 20 minutes waiting for help to come. Doctor said it was instant. It sucked for me because it was so sudden, but I take solace in the fact that he felt no pain. He hated hospitals and never spent a night in one in his 62 years of life. The most ironic thing, and I live in Mexico, is that it was on the Day of the Dead. Hard for me at the time, but man, if I got to have a choice of what day to go, it would be something like that. We had a weird sense of humor. Rip Al. Story 6. There is a gravitational anomaly in space called the Great Attractor, which is pulling everything within the Virgo and Hydra Centaurus superclusters towards it. It lies 150 to 250 million light-years from the Milky Way, which itself is being pulled towards it too. The scary part is that, relative to us, this anomaly lies within the same plane as our own galaxy, making it very difficult to observe. Essentially, we have almost no concrete idea of what it is. On the flip side of the Great Attractor is the Boötes Void, which I find a bit creepy. The Boötes Void, sometimes called the Great Void, is a huge spherical region of space that contains very few galaxies. It's approximately 700 million light-years from Earth and located near the constellation Boötes, which is how it got its name. The supervoid measures 250 million light-years in diameter, representing approximately 0.27% of the diameter of the observable universe, which itself is a daunting 93 billion light-years across, making it the largest known void in the universe. At first, astronomers were only able to find 8 galaxies across the expanse, but further observations revealed a total of 60 galaxies. Now, while that might seem like a lot, it would be like stumbling upon only 60 objects across a region larger than the continental United States. That's just in 2 dimensions. According to astronomer Greg Aldering, the scale of the void is such that, if the Milky Way had been in the center of the Boötes Void, we wouldn't have known there were other galaxies until 1960s. Looking at the volume of the Boötes Void, it should contain about 10,000 galaxies, when considering that the average distance between galaxies elsewhere in the universe is a few million light-years. But the question is, why and how this void came to be? There hasn't been enough time since the universe began for mere gravitational forces to clear out a space of that size. There's a theory that suggests that supervoids are caused by the intermingling of smaller mini-voids, like soap bubbles coming together. But a more, maybe creepier explanation is that the Boötes Void could be the result of an expanding Kardashev 3-scale civilization. As the colonization bubble expands outward from its home system, the civilization dims each star, and subsequently each galaxy it encounters by blanketing it in a Dyson shell. This might also explain why the void has such a nice spherical shape. Oh, and we're seeing a snapshot of the void 700 million years ago. A lot could have happened in 700 million years that we just cannot see or know due to the inherent speed of light. Sweet dreams, everyone. Story 7. The world is literally running out of sand that is used to manufacture concrete. Most of the world's sand is in its deserts, but usable sand only comes from riverbeds, shores, and lake beds. People are being murdered over sand right now. I'm from the Spruce Pine, NC, and I only mention this because you mentioned sand. Our town is known as the home of the highest purity quartz deposits in the world. Apparently, the quartz deposits out here are mined, and the quartz is turned into silica sand, which is then used to manufacture concrete, glass, ceramics, and other things as well. Our quartz deposit is one of around 3 to 4 deposits in the world. The mining of the deposits has had a serious effect on the mountains surrounding the deposits. Just Google the deposits and you will see what I mean. Also, people who work for the Quartz Corp and Feldspar, the owners of the deposits, are pretty much oblivious to the possible health hazards associated with breathing in silica sand all day. My boyfriend worked for Feldspar for around 6 months, after having to quit after he started having breathing issues. The people who own these mineral deposits make an incomprehensible amount of money, yet are still so greedy they refuse to offer their employees proper safety equipment, and also are able to bypass many of the environmental protection laws. They also pay the least in property taxes, yet benefit the most from reaping the property. I know I wrote a lot, but I just thought I'd share so that you guys would have an idea of who the people controlling the sand are. Story 8. We don't fully know how general anesthesia works. My usual technical answer is, it scrambles the brain, but that goes away when we turn the anesthesia off. I knew that general anesthesia caused sleeping issues, but the reason is weird. I attended an animal behavior conference a few years ago that included a lady talking about general anesthetics in bees. The bees had a complex time structure and would normally do certain things in certain times of the day. Those given anesthesia had their body clock shifted by the time that they were under. Like that period didn't exist for them. Their whole body clock was paused. Completely different from if they had been sleeping. Apparently the same is true for humans. Story 9. Antibiotics have been abused and misused for so long that various bacteria strains have started to get resistance to them. What used to be a treatable infection might soon become deadly because we are unable to treat it with the antibiotics we have today. There is research to try and find other ways to treat antibiotic-resistant bacteria. But until then, please use prescribed antibiotics until they are finished, not until you feel better. If unused, do not flush them down the toilet or put them in the bin. Give it to a pharmacy so they can discard them correctly. And use antibiotics when necessary. Some countries give them willy-nilly while others are more conservative. Story 10. It's fairly easy to clone humans. It's really only ethics that's stopping us. We've had the ability to clone since the 1800s. Sea urchins were the first successful clones, and we've successfully cloned sheep, pigs, and rhesus monkeys since then. And I seem to recall the Chinese were working on mixing human DNA with animal DNA. I seem to recall they had some success, but had to destroy the cells because of said ethics. Story 11. Cancer geneticist here. Most cases of cancer that are sequenced generally just denote the prognosis or how long a patient has to live, rather than treatment options. People always say, let's cure cancer. However, this simplifies cancer as though it is only one disease. It's far more complicated than that. I studied at one of the largest cancer hospitals in the world, where the motto is to make cancer history, but the only obtainable goal is to make it chronic. We study and research as much as possible, but every cancer requires different research. And unfortunately, the powers that be often prohibit funding and proficient research. It's work I'm passionate about, but also a broken system that is infuriating to work in. Story 12. In the UK, about 17% of people have fetal alcohol syndrome. McGuire et al. 1992. As much as 17% of us are developmentally disabled simply because, prior to the late 90s, a large proportion of British mothers drank during pregnancy, 41%. Thankfully, the prevalence rate has been falling fast since the late 90s, when all this research was published, but it's terrifying to see how much of an effect AFSD is having in society. Story 13. Soil science adjacent researcher here. We are degrading, polluting, and losing our topsoil at such a rate that we may not be able to produce enough food to feed everyone within 50 to 60 years, let alone what impacts climate change may bring to bear on our food supply. And the US government's crop insurance programs and incentives all reinforce the bad practices, all discouraging regenerative practices. These bad policies are extremely hard to change because of lobbying from the major agribusiness companies who make money off of these short-sighted policies. Our food supply is further threatened by our agricultural overdependence on aquifer water, which is not being replenished, making it an unsustainable source of water. If the aquifers are overdrawn, depleted, or polluted, we hit a hard wall of water scarcity, and we will have no backups to address the problem with. The drawdown of the aquifers also causes land subsidence, which causes costly infrastructure and building damage. The general public does not realize the impending crisis that will be caused by the confluence of these factors. Story 14. Smallpox is really easy to bring back, and it'll kill 1/5 of the planet when it happens. Take some genocidal anger, knowledge tens of thousands have, and about $100,000. Here are all the ways it could happen. Number 1. US or Russian stocks leaked or used as a bioweapon. We keep some intentionally, it's very secure. This is unlikely in my humble opinion. Number 2. Accidentally bumped into an old lab and leaked during cleaning or something. Forgotten stocks are still occasionally found. Leak spreading is very unlikely in my humble opinion. Number 3. Intentional release via recreation. Someone resynthesizes it from scratch via public sequence according to this paper, with about 100,000 in materials. Methods plus difficulty identical to what is published here. It's totally possible and almost simple to do. Smallpox powder dropped in envelopes mailed around the world by a disgruntled underpaid PhD student. See Aurora, Colorado shooter. An outbreak is out of hand before it's noticed, and billions die. Story 15. There's a solar event known as CME, or a coronal mass ejection. It occurs very frequently on a cosmic timescale. Every few decades to centuries, there's a decent-sized one. Why are they scary? A CME is a massive burst of radiation, easily able to fully envelop the Earth in its path, and it's equivalent of a non-stop EMP barrage. The last time a big one hit the Earth was when we had telegraph lines for communications and they spontaneously caught fire. In today's world, with everything running on electricity, when the next big one hits, we'll have at most a few days warning. And it'd be a literal apocalypse movie scenario, with planes going down due to their whole electrical system frying, nobody's vehicle starting, untold billions in fire damage would wreak havoc everywhere, and the machines we depend on to help would be similarly fried. Some stuff would be unaffected, being parked in deep, concrete-roofed parking garages and the like, but our entire infrastructure would be useless for years. It'd literally send us into a mini dark age while people tried to get things working again. Recovery would take decades to centuries. Story 16. Haven't seen this one yet. Insects are going extinct. We have lost a significant chunk just since the 80s. I think it was around 20%. Mosies are going up because of course, but just about everything else is going. Wasn't until I read this that I realized that as a kid in the 90s, I used to see butterflies all the time, dragonflies. My house used to get invaded by Christmas beetles every year. Not so much. These days I might see only 1 or 2 Christmas beetles in December, if any at all. When I was a kid, I remember finding 8 in my house in a single night. Same house. Story 17. Here are a few scary medical science facts regarding CPR that you won't often hear in your first aid or CPR class put on in school. I only learned this stuff after schooling to become an EMT. What's the success rate of CPR? The average person assumes 75% or greater. In reality, it's barely 10%. It's one of the first things they told us in training because all new people have way too high of an expectation of the effectiveness of CPR. It can be very depressing when you're doing everything you were trained for and aren't getting the results you think you should be getting. The time from collapse to the administration of a shock via AED is absolutely paramount. They say the chances of survival drop 10% per minute. Oh, and rescue breaths. If you're not being very, and I mean very careful, you'll cause gastric dissension. You'll literally be blowing up their stomach, and they will vomit. And there are the cracks and crackles. If done right, it'll sound and feel like you're breaking every rib in little old lady Nelson's chest. You're likely not. It's cartilage and other bits shifting. Although, if you're a bit too vigorous, you may very well break a rib or two. But hey, they're already dead, so it doesn't matter. They'd rather be alive with a broken rib than dead. Story 18. Application Security Engineer here. I know that cybersecurity is not the science most people were probably hoping for, but I have some fun facts about your data. For starters, Facebook builds shadow profiles of people, so even if you don't have a Facebook, you do. Facebook collects your data from many sites you visit. If you see a like or share button on Facebook, they're collecting the data and adding it to the shadow profile. They basically stalk you, from seeing how long you're on a web page to what you click. This is usually used for advertising purposes, but was also used for nefarious purposes as seen with Cambridge Analytica. Secondly, in many countries, namely the USA, your data is for sale. From voter records to your address and the people you live with. Each US state has its own laws about selling voter data, but for example, North Carolina allows you to download all the voter data for free. The voter data included are full name, address, voter ID, phone number, race or ethnicity, gender, where you were born, when you were born, county, age, driver's license number, and more. We wanted to see how accurate this could be, and used Florida voter data to check my stepfather's information. It gave us his current address, voter ID, full name, phone number, and what party he voted for in 2020. It was also all accurate. Third, with breaches like the one we saw with Facebook, people can cross-reference your information and find you easily. If you think about it, this could lead to extreme terrorism from people who don't agree with you politically, which is pretty scary. Finally, if you toss in a website like White Pages, they can cross-reference this information to find friends, family, previous numbers, addresses, and sometimes emails of you and your loved ones. And all this information is protected only by a paywall. If they really want to get into the open source intelligence of this, they can look for breaches on your email or number in database dumps on sites like thehash.com and could even potentially take over your accounts. Some breaches might even include hacked voter data, which straight up leaks your social security number. Story 19. The doomsday clock is a hypothetical clock in which 12 a.m. or midnight is meant to be the point at which our species is eradicated by way of war or natural means. Scientists operate the clock and change the time based in the current environment. During times of uncertainty, such as war or humanitarian crises, the time would be set closer to midnight. The supposedly calmest time in the past few decades was in 1991. We have been closest to midnight in these four instances. Number 1. 1949. Soviets' first nuclear test, 3 minutes. 2. 1953. US tests the hydrogen bomb, 2 minutes. 3. 1984. US-Soviet relations reaches their lowest point, and when our species was arguably closest to nuclear eradication, 3 minutes. And finally, for the past 3 years. We are not in a time of great conflict or war, yet we are closer today, according to scientists running the clock, than we have ever been to our own destruction as a species. The ongoing creation of nuclear weapons, the perpetual threat of cybersecurity, and of course, climate change and environmental destruction. We've been counting down from 3 minutes for the past 4 years. We are currently set closer than ever before, at just 100 seconds to midnight. Edit. The clock updates once a year. With everything going on now, we're probably even closer. Story 20. There's an amoeba called Naegleria fowleri that lives in shower water, tap water, ACs, springs, and lakes that can crawl into your sinus and travel upwards slowly until it carves its way into your brain, if you do not have a strong enough immune response. The water needs to be sprayed inside of the nose and be quite forceful, and it can't be from a small amount like mist or a droplet, because the amoeba is too heavy to travel that way, and one amoeba won't make it. If you get the infection, it's 99% fatal. There have been 2 survivors, one was a normal child, and the other is a now mentally deficient man in his 40s. Its closest cousin, Acanthamoeba, lives in construction dust, dirt, ground dust, sand, mud, your floor where you walk in, extremely shallow water, and is 100% fatal. It can also cause non-specific pink eye and eye infections that progress into the brain. Story 21. There was a massive solar storm in 2012 that missed the Earth by around 25 days. It was described as a Carrington-class event, and had it hit Earth head-on, it would have fried anything running on electricity and would have thrown us back to the Stone Age. In June 2013, a joint venture from researchers at Lloyd's of London and Atmospheric and Environmental Research, or AER in the United States, used data from the Carrington event to estimate the cost of a similar event in the present to the US alone at $0.6 to $2.6 trillion, which at the time equated to roughly 3.6% to 15.5% of annual GDP. According to NASA, analysts believe that a direct hit by an extreme CME, such as the one that missed Earth in July 2012, could cause widespread power blackouts, disabling everything that plugs into a wall socket. Most people wouldn't even be able to flush their toilets because urban water supplies largely rely on electric pumps. The reason why we know so much about it was because the storm hit the Stereo A Solar Observatory, which survived because it was specifically designed to survive a solar storm. So, unless your electrical supply is as well protected as a literal solar satellite, you're shit out of luck. The upshot is that you'd be able to see the aurora pretty much wherever you are in the world. So there's that.
FBI and CIA agents of Reddit. What's something that you can tell us without killing us? Story 1. There's a book called The Moscow Rules. It was written by 2 CIA people all about, well, disguise. The CIA had all these agents in Russia, but the Russians were insane about following literally every single American in Russia 24/7 looking for spies. So a huge part of their job was trying to shake off the Committee for Safe Security. They had crazy quick-change disguises and all sorts of stuff. And the movie Argo was based on one of the writers somewhat. Wait, really? That's kinda cool. I negotiated huge deals with the Russian government. I was tailed 24/7. One time, I didn't like the room the hotel gave me. I knew I faced the noisy side because I stayed there all the time. And instead of giving me a new room, it was a 90-minute wait while they bugged a new room for me. Twice I had a bizarre run-in with a pushy, very hot, in quotations, woman who allegedly wanted to screw me so bad. Even if I was straight, hot in Russia is a mix between a brat's doll and a hooker, so no thanks. Same with China. You can only go with blank phones every now and then. Your phone will do this little glitch as if it's being accessed. Story 2. If you go through the FBI interview process, it takes a while. Chances are you're gonna have to spend some time working on crimes against children, which is really tough and most people don't want to do it. Yeah, understandable. I heard a story here on Reddit about how somebody was involved in a case against like a predator or something, and he had to go through every image on his hard drive to flag anything that was child porn. I hate it. That case just drove him out of the industry. I can't even imagine. I read an article once about how the government has people whose job is to look at disturbing videos and images from the internet, and they seized hard drives. Mainly of child pornography, but also things like executions and to find clues and locations, the identity of the people involved, etc. It's an important job, but the burnout rate is astronomical. A lot of them end up with PTSD, addiction issues, and other problems. Story 3. Not CIA, but I've worked with and know guys in intelligence. Most of the intelligence we get is from OSINT, open source intel, i.e. news articles, press releases, news networks, and government announcements. Most people think that everyone in intelligence is some James Bond/Jason Bourne type of individual, when in reality the majority of analysts just sit at a desk and go through news articles all day, really. That said, that's not the only method we have to gather intel, but that is where most of it comes from. Even analysts that are using other methods such as geospatial intelligence, imagery intelligence, and signals intelligence spend most of their days cropping images for minute details or replaying and monitoring the same signal over and over again. Story 4. Worked with a woman who was former National Security Agency. We would always beg her to tell us stuff, but she never did. The one thing she did say, though, was that during training they show him a video of a bunch of things that they found out and stopped. She hardly slept for 2 weeks after watching that, apparently. Yeah, I'm not even gonna imagine what the hell they showed her. Anyway, I have a relative that retired from the National Security Agency a few years ago. She talked about a few things in generalities, nothing specific. Among them, however, you will see things that entirely change your view of the world. People go in there all the time with lofty goals of changing things, and within months those goals are mostly gone. Still, if you want to change things, you work for the agency. If you just want to make money, you work for a contractor. No one cares what contractors have to say. Most people that stay long enough will do a tour of counter-terrorism. Many people transfer after a few months, and the average stay is 2 years because of the visuals. Those who stick around for a long time often change for the worse, and many struggle with mental illnesses, become alcoholics, get divorced, and generally just lead to miserable lives with their work as the only reason of continuing. Hell, alcoholism in general is just rife in the agency. When you cannot speak to anyone outside the agency about your work, it becomes nearly impossible to confide anyone close to you. Even if you have close work friends or family, you have to be careful what you say because not everyone is read into every program. 2 people can sit next to each other in the same office, work on the same subject for months, and never talk about it with each other even though they're close friends outside of the agency. So, people turn to the bottle. Her husband worked for a different government agency and has also had a top-secret sensitive compartmented information clearance, but she couldn't talk about her work with him, nor could he be with her because, he didn't want to involve the intelligence community. The agency employs psychiatrists who are cleared to be read into almost any program. Going to them, though, is often seen as a mark of shame among the other agency employees, so they are not used as nearly as they should be. She told me most of these things while trying to recruit me. She believed that I should go in knowing and what to expect. I eventually declined to apply. Story 5. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but a mentor who definitely wasn't supposed to tell me used to be a white hat for the FBI. Apparently, all he did was search for pedophiles by tracking child porn. He said he didn't stay for very long because it was messing with his mentality, which is very much understandable. He left to join the Navy instead. Became a nuke EM, but they pulled him out of the program because of his cybersecurity skills, and before I left our command, he was helping our civilian-military cooperation connect his computer to a projector. Sorry that I had to put you in the spotlight, EM1. Story 6. Operation Ivy Bells was a plan to tap Soviet communication lines. The cover story that they used was that they had divers diving down to recover fragments of a new Soviet supersonic anti-ship missile. The communication line tap was a failure due to a spy. However, the dive team successfully recovered all the fragments of the missiles from the Soviet weapons tests. The US was able to reverse engineer one and subsequently learned that they were radar-guided only and assumed IR guidance did not exist. This is a lot of technical shit that I'm not understanding. But anyway, the tap was successful, and recordings were recovered by dive teams over many months. The tap was ultimately discovered by the Soviets because of the information provided to them by Ronald Pelton, the spy you mentioned. Story 7. 2 family stories even though this will probably get buried. Well, clearly not, because I'm reading it. Anyway, number 1. My father's uncle told everyone for his entire life that he worked at a button factory. It was only revealed after his death that he, in fact, worked at a missile factory and assembled the gyroscopes for the guidance in missiles. And number 2. We always knew my grandfather worked for the government at the Pentagon. We never knew what exactly he did, but every 6 months or so he would call up to talk to my mum. The conversation was pretty much the same as always. My mum and grandfather would catch up for a few, then it would turn into, "So I have another clearance upgrade coming up. You'll probably get a call like always, just wanted to give you the heads up." Sure than sure, a week later some government agency would call up, it was always a different one each time, and ask for my mum. They would ask a bunch of questions, and that would be that. When he died from Alzheimer's at his funeral, 4 men in black suits attended, and no one knew who they were. After the burial, they approached his widow and handed her a plaque with 17 government agency symbols on it. Turns out he was responsible for the interagency cooperation and training. Now, basically, everyone got to talk to each other. Now his son works for him, doing what? We don't know, and we don't ask. Story 8. I once rented out my old farmhouse to a family. They paid the rent every month, and other than not mowing the lawn to save their life, I didn't think anything bad about them. That all changed when the DEA called me to inform me that my renter had been murdered in Mexico and was asking my permission to search for the property. Well, it turns out I had unknowingly rented my house to a Mexican mob, and they were using it as a safe house. It all fell apart for them when 2 of them got caught with a duffel bag full of meth. My renter had to go back to Mexico to visit his mother and was promptly murdered. Let's just say I am no longer a landlord and never will be again. You didn't even bother to ask if he worked for a Mexican cartel? Jeez, dude, come on. Story 9. You want to work for them? be prepared to do a fair amount of paperwork. The form will ask for each of your employers' contact information, the contact information of your friends, your history of addresses, etc. They will then send an agent to interview a number of these people. Next, you have to take a psychological exam and be interviewed by a psychologist. Finally, you'll have one last interview with a polygraph and a professional lie detector. Wow, that sounds like fun. Story 10. I talked with some CIA recruiters towards the end of college and almost applied earnestly after a large Q&A and then a much smaller one. The thing that stuck out to me was that the guy said that most CIA agents are just out of shape and have limited combat training with guns or hand-to-hand. They made it clear that it's the military that uses force. If confronted, they would train to immediately surrender or drop their bags and run if possible. Jesus, alright. Well, my sister is an intelligence officer who was assigned to special forces, operating in Afghanistan for, just a period of time. She had to go through a gun qualification course and failed. This meant that she was not allowed to carry a firearm while deployed, which is probably for the best. The instructor told her that she was one of a very select group that was so bad at shooting that they could just not pass, and jokingly gave her a knife to carry. She spent the deployment doing whatever she does, some sort of analysis, and then hanging around the gym so she could watch buff guys just force lift. She is thirsty, I'm telling you now. Story 11. When I was 16, I became very close, very fast friends with this guy in my school choir. His dad went on business trips for his work at Lockheed Martin 3 or 4 times a month, always to Chicago. This kid who was my friend, we went everywhere together for about 3 months after being very casually acquaintances for like 2 years. After school, we'd hang around until 10 p.m. or so almost every night, and we'd get lunch at the same time at the same place. We switched our class schedules to be in the same history or language arts sections together, etc. Just your basic nerdy dudes finding a kindred spirit, if you will. I guess our sudden friendship raised an eyebrow or two, because one day my friend came to school and said that his dad were asking him lots of questions about me, who my parents were, what my house was like, did he ever meet my siblings, and if I was an obedient student or if I was snarky. My buddy suspected the questions were being relayed from his dad's boss. Story 12. Not either of those, but I've had clearance, so I can weigh in a little. 2 things. Firstly, the most secret stuff happens right in front of people's faces under the guise of being normal everyday stuff. Secondly, properly secret programs and operations are never named in any way that indicates what they're actually about. They're generally just 2 words chosen at random, and they would rarely come up in a normal conversation, like cracked gorilla, which I just made up off the top of my head. So when people talk about classified stuff, it's a name that is super topical, and it's either very, very old or just a nickname at best. Only public programs and operations have topical names such as PR Motive, like Desert Storm. Story 13. I was in the sauna at my gym when this naked old man with extremely long testicles started talking to me. Somehow the conversation ended up on the topic of my new roommate, who happened to be Saudi Arabian. He then proceeded to tell me if he worked for the FBI and knew exactly who I was, and asked if I would make him some money every now and then for giving him information. I said, sure. Not because my roommate was sketchy, but because he got drunk one day and he pissed on my couch. This was 10 or so years ago, and I never really heard from him, but I think my phone was tapped for a short span of time. Story 14. I have a few friends that are CIA officers. First things first is that people who work for the CIA are not CIA agents, they are officers. The people that they recruit to spy for them are agents. Also, going on a tangent, I'm 90% sure I've been one of those agents when I was dealing with a Mexican logistics company whilst working at General Motors. The logistics company we were dealing with was owned by this multi-billion-dollar Mexican clan, and all the ultra-wealthy clans in Mexico have ties to various cartels. So, some federal agencies got involved. Mainly FBI and I believe a few DEA, but one guy was specifically not wearing any badges, was not willing to identify what agency he was working for, and questioned me a lot on specific details of what the company's capabilities were. Though, getting back on track, anyone who is a US citizen can apply to join the CIA. It really isn't that hard. If you have just about any computer science degree, or a degree in statistics, or engineering, or accounting, and don't have anything that would screw up and you got a clearance, getting a job would be relatively easy though. And, as implied with that previous comment, working at the CIA is far more boring than you would think. Lots of tracing manufacturing capabilities, and from what I described with that Mexican logistics company, to finding out how China sources the components they use to manufacture their satellites. Story 15. My ex was married to an FBI agent and was told many times about the insanely long interview period. She mentioned that they went back to even interview his kindergarten teacher. She also told me if there were truly anyone in your life that was a CIA agent, you would never know. They would be inconspicuous. They would truly be sworn to secrecy, and they would never be an instance of them casually mentioning or bragging, "Hey, I used to work at the CIA." Those people don't actually work for the CIA. Story 16. My sister-in-law is involved with these organizations. She can't tell us much about what she does, but she has a large backpack with a radio phone on top. If the phone rings, she's told us not to answer it. You just drop everything and get out of town as faster than ASAP. What if the phone calls and it's just like, "We've been trying to reach you regarding your car's extended warranty"? Story 17. Not CIA or FBI, but I work for the Department of Energy in their property management. Not really much of a secret, but the amount of wasteful spending I see every day would make anyone angry about where the taxpayers' dollars are going. And we're nowhere near as bad as the Department of Defense, but it still makes me upset sometimes. They'll spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on one day on some items, just to throw them away the next day because they didn't like what they bought. One example, they bought new keyboard holders for people's desks. Not just a few of them to test them, however. I'm talking over $100,000 worth of keyboard holders. So they got them, tried one out, and didn't like it, so they sent it to my department to be just thrown out and destroyed. And this is a daily occurrence, with things much more expensive. If you're sitting there wondering, what's the most expensive single thing I've ever had to destroy? It was $1.7 million. Why did we have to destroy it? They just wanted something different. It still worked just fine. Oh well, I get to be employed and play with some fun toys they throw away. Ha ha! Story 18. Somewhat unrelated, but my great-uncle was an FBI agent. Every time we would ask him if he ever had anything interesting like stories or so, but he would say he was sworn to secrecy. After 10 years of hearing this, my sister asked, "Really?" And he replied with, "No, I just don't remember anything interesting happening." Story 19. I worked with the Australian Federal Police with the Spider Squad doing computer stuff for them in regards to finding pedos and finding trafficking victims. It is the most heartbreaking work, but when you get them, the office looked like NASA after a Mars landing. Story 20. My aunt has been an FBI agent for 25 years. The only thing I know about her job is that she's an office administrator. But her information went public somehow when she was part of the team that investigated the Mandalay Bay shooting in Las Vegas. Someone found the name and addresses of most of the agents that worked the scene and put it up online. Not sure why. She also took me and my family on a tour of the Las Vegas FBI headquarters about 15 years ago now. One interesting thing that I remember about the buildings was that all the doors were floor-to-ceiling, 9-foot doors. I just thought that was weird. Story 21. My dad worked for the GCHQ in the 80s, doing some voice recognition, and he can't say anything more for a decade. Well, the way they can recognize you by Siri Google today was used in the 80s. Just a bit slower. Story 22. Not an FBI or a CIA officer here, but my sister is a district attorney, and over the years she has prosecuted a number of animal cruelty cases. This led to her having an ongoing partnership with the FBI for the last several years. It turns out the FBI started tracking animal abuse cases about 10 to 15 years ago due to the incredibly high correlation between abusing animals when you're young and becoming a serial violent offender as an adult. Story 23. Met an old, retired CIA spook at a wedding reception. Spitting image of Colonel Sanders. He was amazing. So I asked him, "I don't want you to tell me anything you can't, but I'd love to know when Kennedy got killed. What was the talk around the water cooler in the office?" He didn't halt or pause to think. "Hell, we all thought Johnson did it." Story 24. My high school girlfriend worked for the National Reconnaissance Office after college. At the time, they were responsible for analyzing the nation's spy satellite photos. She told me two things. There's a special garbage chute for classified materials. It's in the hallway. When you are new, a hazing ritual, they tell you have to shout out your badge number down the chute before throwing in any materials. This is hilarious. She wouldn't tell me anything about the resolution quality of the spy photos, of course, but she did let it slip that because Russian sailors will sunbathe nude on their decks of the submarines in the Black Sea, several women in the office would pin those photos up in their cubicles as beefcake photos. So a few decades ago, US spy photos could resolve the Russian penis. Story 25. Brian Bendis, creator of Miles Morales, author of House of M, etc. I cannot wait for Spider-Man 2 this year. Has a story about doing a talk at GBCI at Langley and being told to wait in the break room, not allowed to have his laptop, phone, his notebook or pen, but where he was applied with a notebook during the interview, and when he walked in that he'd be reviewed when he left. A young analyst walks in for coffee, sees him sitting there, recognized him as a famous comic book author Brian Michael Bendis, and starts to react like a fan. He then pauses, starts sweating, and quietly asks Bendis if this is a test of some kind. Story 26. While in college, 1978 to 79, this textbook in my poli-sci class told of a time when Nixon was in office and demanded to leave the White House to go to a musical. Unplanned, no prep for anything, major disaster, Secret Service. Eventually they got Nixon to calm down and they never went out. One of our close new neighbors happened to work for the Secret Service. His family came over to our family home for dinner one evening. Eventually, it came out he worked on the Nixon detail a few years back, and that's when I shared the story I read in my textbook. He actually almost dropped his fork and stayed there with his mouth wide open. Apparently, the story was not only true, but it was supposed to be a secret. I showed him my book, and he notated the author. I have no idea the outcome, but it made the night even more interesting. Story 27. My dad works for a 3-letter organization, and this day, I still have no idea what he does. It's so funny, growing up not knowing what my dad did. It felt normal. My dad would leave for a week, be home for a week, leave for 2, home for 3. He always had a present for me whenever he came back from whatever country he was in. All in all, it never really struck me as odd as a kid. It wasn't until I was an adult that it really did stick out as abnormal. But now, to answer your question, he has only ever told me one thing. Every so often, he'll send me a text, even now as a grown 30-year-old, change your passwords. And I always do, without question. Story 28. I did an internship at the CIA for my senior year. Something to be aware of, the vast majority of people here are probably lying. When you sign on to work for the CIA, anything you say about working there must go through a review process where they can either approve or deny what you'd like to share. This agreement is in place for the rest of your life. This is something I got approval to share. The CIA doesn't blackmail people for information. They might pay you or give you some benefits, but their inside people aren't under duress. This is not the case for many foreign intelligence agencies. Story 29. I interned for a year with the Joint Intelligence Services in the UK, more or less the equivalent to the CIA in the US, doing a year out at university. I was offered a job upon graduation, but I turned it down to work in a more private sector for more money. First things first, it's quite a bit more boring than people think. It's effectively a regular office job if you work in the surrounding infrastructure without direct contact with sensitive material. It's just a large organization that has a different core goal than normal profit-oriented organizations. I can't actually talk about the things that I worked on, but trust me when I say it's not very interesting and it all sounds like very average corporate work. Very normal atmosphere, quite a young crowd, office parties, etc. were still a thing. I worked in a cool building too, effectively known as the Donut. The interesting stuff is actually all about the recruitment process and the rules about working there. The recruitment process was very in-depth in terms of vetting, multiple drug tests, family history, and questionnaires alongside the normal interviews and applications. I believe if you had dual citizenship, British/anything else, you actually had to renounce the other citizenship to even accept an internship there. Because of the nature of the hiring process and how difficult it is, job mobility within the organization is very free-flowing. I didn't get to experience that part as I didn't take a permanent job, but I'm told you could very easily switch between departments or even transfer between branches. You were not allowed to tell anyone that you worked for the organization other than your immediate family and your partner. You were told to tell people that you are working for the civil service, and to be unspecific about which department. You are not allowed to refer to M15, M16, GCHQ, Joint Intelligence Services, by name in any conversation outside of closed doors. You could only call it the organization, even in interviews. You could not discuss your work with anyone in your life, not even your family. If they ask how your day was, you cannot go into specifics. So, if you know anyone who says they work for the civil service, but doesn't really go into much detail, it's possible that they work for the intelligence services. In fact, if you suspect a dead relative of yours worked for the organization during their lifetime, there's a service that they offer to confirm that this is for you, though they'll only tell you if they're dead. The job also paid surprisingly well. As an immediate year student, I earned nearly $27,000 for my 12-month internship. Some of my friends took internships at prestigious investment banks which paid less in the same year. The job offer, immediately out of uni, was nearly into the 40s. I haven't had to fire up my CV yet since doing it, but I'm told I'm allowed to state vaguely my job role on it, but not to be too specific and obviously not discuss it on sensitive topics. Overall, 10 out of 10 would recommend. It's a good place to work, the benefits are good, and it's interesting work. Don't pursue something like this if you're in for the clout or the action, though. There is no action, and you're literally not allowed to tell anyone that you work there.
What are some declassified government documents that are surprisingly terrifying? Story 1. Not declassified but leaked. Operation Yellowhammer. The government tried to say it was old, but it had an August date on it. It's the UK government's plan for the eventuality of a no-deal Brexit. Basically, life in the UK would be turned upside down for a few months. Food and medical shortages are expected. The royal family might be evacuated to a safe place. The police will have too much on their hands to investigate crimes, etc. Story 2. CIA involvement in starting the Guatemalan Civil War, which lasted 36 years and led to the genocide of hundreds of thousands of indigenous people, and set up the country for the show that is Guatemala today, just like Nicaragua. Guatemala is a beautiful country, and the people are also beautiful, but as one taxi driver said to me, 25 families own everything in the country. Corruption is rife, and the destabilization caused by the involvement of the US has been devastating for the country and its people. I watched from my hotel balcony as people come to the lake to bathe and wash their clothes. There's also funding the death squads in Nicaragua and funding and training mass murderers in El Salvador, while artificially extending their civil war. This stuff is why I hate when should say, they should stay in their country and fix their problems, when a good chunk of the problems in Central and South America were directly caused by the US. There's also this. Most of the torture programs got their start with the CIA. Story 3. My hometown was littered with radioactive waste by the federal government as part of the Manhattan Project. Then we wonder why cancer and thyroid conditions are the norm. I grew up 2 miles from the Low, or Lake Ontario Ordnance Works site, and my dad grew up on the 89th Street in Niagara Falls in the 40s. He remembers sitting on the train tracks as a kid, watching the Hooker chemical trucks bring in 55-gallon drums to the Love Canal. That whole area was contaminated with all sorts of nasty stuff. So what did? They bulldozed it over and built houses on it, of course. Then in the 70s, when people were noticing toxic sludge in their basements, kids' feet were being literally burned by high levels of phosphorus in the ground, and people were getting sick, they acted like they knew nothing. Eventually, people sued, and the whole area was evacuated. They tried to clean it up, but they basically put tons of dirt and clay over the area as a cap, and it's all fenced off. You can see it when you drive east on the Niagara Falls Expressway to Towanda. For the Lewiston storage site, also known as the NFSS Niagara Falls storage site, I've read documents where they had hazardous storage barrels sitting exposed to the elements, the seepage and all that. Again, they've covered everything with clay to stop it, but it's already in the ground. The bad thing is that there's a large elementary and high school, about 2 miles from the site, which is actually on property that used to be part of the site but was never used and was sold to the county. Needless to say, the cancer rate among long-term staff and teachers is higher than average. I'm glad to have finally moved away. Story 4. In East Germany, a committed freedom fighter and her husband dealt with having their home raided while she was away, being arrested on the way to protests and all sorts of state-sponsored harassment. After the wall fell, she was able to read the documents the Stasi had kept on her and found out her own husband was an undercover agent and had written many reports on her activities with a bloodless banality. Story 5. Operation Northwoods, a plan for a false flag operation that came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Department of Defense in 1962 and was given to JFK, who turned it down. The plan called for the CIA to commit terrorist actions against U.S. civilians across the United States and frame Cuba, allowing us the right to invade and depose Castro and the communist government there. It was declassified and can be found online at the JFK Library. It is terrifying that no one knows or seems to care that this was suggested by our government to the president. Story 6. When the Space Shuttle Challenger was destroyed, it was reported that all 7 astronauts were killed instantly. Decades later, it was revealed that some, if not all, of the astronauts survived the initial explosion as the cockpit cabin had enough protection to prevent breaching. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, they were awake and aware as they plummeted toward the Atlantic Ocean. Understandably, NASA knew that the news of the terrifying deaths would have crippled the space program even more than it already did. In flight school, we looked at this, and there's evidence to support the claim that the crew was still running their procedures even after it was obvious that things had gone wrong. They didn't die accepting their fate. They died as astronauts. That's something to be admired, in my opinion. Story 7. As part of the Army and CIA's experiments into mind control, they put electrodes into the pleasure centers of dogs' brains. Initially, they wanted hundreds of dogs, but they only managed to get 10. And of those, only a few were implanted. The implanted dogs would be remote controlled by zapping them and essentially giving them a dose of dopamine when they were facing the right direction. The controllers would stop the zap when they wanted the dogs to stop, and then the dogs would reorient themselves until they were facing the correct direction. This meant that when the controllers weren't present, the dogs that had been implanted would continually spin in circles, even in their cages, always looking for the direction that gave them that next hit. The program ran out of funding in the mid-60s, and the dogs were destroyed. Story 8. MKUltra was a partially illegal, forced mind control experiment utilizing psychoactive drugs conducted by the CIA in the 1950s and 1960s. Ken Kesey, the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, participated in these tests in the 1960s, although his participation was voluntary. His experiences with government LSD experiments led him to become an advocate for psychedelics. His friends formed the Merry Pranksters, who were a precursor to the hippie counterculture in the 1960s. This upended a lot of social norms to the point where the establishment began to freak out, labeling the hippies as pro-Soviet and enacting the war on drugs to more effectively suppress the counterculture, along with other groups deemed undesirable. There was some serious racism going on too. The US pushed heavily for prohibition at the UN, so most countries in the world started suppressing drugs and the countercultures that used them. This horrible puritanism still affects drug policy to this day, even for things as benign as CBD. In the UK, for example, the Home Office mandates that all hemp sold must contain 0% THC and bans home growing. You need a license, which costs around £5,000, including a non-refundable application. Occasionally raiding hemp farmers and small CBD specialists, while large chains can sell full-spectrum extract that probably contains THC traces. If you're the CEO of British Sugar and you're married to the minister responsible for drug policy, though, you can grow THC-rich medical cannabis for export and make a fortune. None for British citizens, though. They can have their seizures and like them, unless they're making enough bad PR for the Home Office to make a rare exception. We also used to have an addiction treatment scheme so successful it was called the British system abroad, but it was wound up to appease the US's puritanical desire to crush the counterculture. Trillions in cash were wasted, millions of lives were ruined for nonviolent drug offenses, and thousands of morally repugnant gangs existed because of prohibition. All because shady military experiments let the cat out of the bag and released something they couldn't control. Story 9. I don't think it's classified, but there was a project called Thor, which aimed to use a satellite bomber to bomb a city. Imagine a missile or a bomb coming from space, and before you know it, your city's destroyed by a falling missile or bomb. It was called Rods from God, and it would have used kinetic energy without explosives. It would have used a series of 20,000-pound tungsten rods to destroy and vaporize without the radiation of a nuclear bomb. It was only avoided because we signed treaties with the Russians not to weaponize space. Story 10. This isn't really a classified document, but at one point, the US government was telling people to build your own bomb shelter to protect your family. It showed how to dig an 8-foot by 4-foot by 10-foot hole in your backyard, and if there was a nuclear threat, to get your family to go in there and cover it with a door. Obviously, that wouldn't really protect anyone in the case of a nuclear attack. Later, it came out that the purpose of telling families to do that was so that if there was a nuclear attack on American soil, they wouldn't have to bury as many bodies because the families dug their own graves. So yeah, not classified, but along the same disturbing lines as the US government did. Story 11. Not really terrifying, but messed up. After World War II, the US government took Nazi scientists and shipped them to America to do science. Some of them came straight from Nuremberg cells. The most noteworthy is Werner von Braun, who built the V-2 rockets with Jewish slave labor. Every day, they would execute the 5 slowest workers in front of the other workers to incentivize them to work harder. Once he came to America, we shipped him to Huntsville, Alabama, where he built the Saturn V, the rocket used in the Apollo program, and got us to the moon. Story 12. When they performed a lobotomy in Rosemary Kennedy due to her intellectual disability, her father arranged a prefrontal lobotomy for her at the age of 23. At the time, the procedure had only been done about 100 times in the US. It failed, leaving her unable to speak intelligibly and incapacitated. She was conscious during the operation, and they say that the neurosurgeons asked the patient to count from 10 to know where they should stop cutting. I've heard that they stopped when her speech became incoherent. The saddest thing is that she had to endure it for 64 years, all because her family couldn't risk any political embarrassment. Story 13. This is a rabbit hole of a case, only partially classified by the CIA until information was released 3 years after his initial capture. Robert Levinson, a former FBI agent, retired and began working as a private investigator, specializing in Russian crime circles. Levinson traveled to the Persian Gulf's Kish Island, which had fewer restrictions on American passports due to being a free trade zone, to enter Iran. He was last seen on March 9, 2007. For 3 years after his disappearance, the US government was adamant that he was not acting with a government party, only private PI work. After 3 years, it was confirmed that Levinson was acting as a part of the CIA on an authorized mission to gather data on the Iranian regime. He had a proof of life appearance in 2010. Levinson had 7 kids, one of whom traveled with his mom to Iran to find their dad and husband, only to be shown plain manifestos by Iranian officials, suggesting that Levinson had left. As of 2013, if he's still alive, Levinson is the longest-held American captive at 12 years. Story 14. Operation Unthinkable was a hypothetical UK war plan that would have started World War II before it was even over. It called for Allied troops to attack the Soviet Red Army at Berlin and push them out of Europe entirely. Not having the manpower to fight them alone, the plan not only relied heavily on American forces, but also called for the rearmament of German soldiers, who would then fight alongside the Allies. The plan didn't get much traction because public support by that point would have been close to zero, and the Americans weren't interested since they still had Japan to deal with. A war against the Soviets would likely lead to a Soviet-Japanese alliance. Among other obvious issues with the plan, it's not really terrifying, I suppose, but it would have fundamentally reshaped the world we live in today if it had gone ahead. Story 15. The CIA's heart attack gun. The KGB had a similar device, which prompted the CIA to invent one as well. In 1975, the United States Senate Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with respect to intelligence activities, also known as the Church Committee, looked into activities by the CIA, NSA, and FBI. In 1975, there were also White House and House of Representatives committees to look into those agencies. The heart attack gun was revealed at committee hearings. The first big issue for the committee was that those agencies had free rein to do what they wanted. The Church Committee's investigations led to the Senate Intelligence Committee overseeing the CIA, which until then had not had any congressional oversight. The very existence of the National Security Agency wasn't revealed to the public until the Church Committee. Other revelations include NSA spying on the American public without warrants, Project Minaret and Project Shamrock. Even committee chairman Frank Church had been spied on. The CIA illegally acquired information on Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers. The CIA plotted the assassination of at least 5 foreign leaders. The CIA tried to work with American mobsters to have Fidel Castro Operation Mongoose. The CIA drugged unknowing individuals with LSD as part of mind control experiments, Project MK-Ultra, and destroyed documents related to the project. In the 1990s, the CIA provided flawed nuclear weapon plans to the Iranian government. Operation Merlin. The Iranians discovered and corrected the flaws so their nuclear program was actually accelerated by the CIA. In 2014, there was a Senate Intelligence Committee report on CIA torture. The CIA routinely used brutal torture methods against suspected terrorists and lied to other parts of the US government about them. Significant numbers of people held by the CIA were totally innocent. The committee found no instance where torture led to actionable intelligence. Torturers and those who authorized torture were not held accountable. The CIA spied on Senate committee members investigating them. The full report itself was classified and accidentally destroyed by the CIA. In 2005, the CIA destroyed video evidence of torture against detainees. No one was punished for destroying the evidence. Story 16. The documents from United States versus Reynolds. The short version is that a B-29 crashed and there was an official report about the cause. Families of people who died in the crash wanted the report, which may have included evidence of negligence that led to their deaths. Because the report was embarrassing, the US government refused to hand it over and claimed, falsely, that it contained sensitive information about military secrets. They asserted what is now known as the state secrets privilege to keep facts from the affected families and from the public at large. Courts, up to the Supreme Court, accepted this argument and established the principle by precedent. Decades later, the report was declassified and there were no secrets in it. The entire thing was just a lie all along, and the courts went along with it.
The practical result is that the government can just lie at any time about national security whenever they want to cover up evil or idiotic actions by government officials. They always get away with it. That's why, for example, people tortured by the CIA can't sue, because their torture program is a state secret. Story 17. The Dyatlov Pass Incident. This is one of the most eerie events in history. Essentially, a group of college students embarked on a hiking trip in Siberia. They never returned, and a rescue team was sent out to find them. The search party discovered their bodies scattered around, each with various injuries. One of the students was found without eyes or a tongue. None of them were clothed, just in their underwear, and temperatures so cold that any skin exposure could lead to instant frostbite. Their clothes were neatly packed up at the campsite, alongside their stove and the rest of their supplies. Radiation was also detected in the clothes. The tents appeared to have been sliced open from the inside. When it came time for their funerals, the USSR attempted to conceal their deaths, even removing leaflets regarding the funeral from the college campus where they were living before their deaths. This is truly bizarre. Story 18. The US's motivation to enter the Vietnam War was built on a lie. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident, also known as the USS Maddox Incident, was an international confrontation that led to the United States engaging more directly in the Vietnam War. It involved one real and one falsely claimed confrontation between ships of North Vietnam and the United States in the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. The original American reports blamed North Vietnam for both incidents, but the Pentagon Papers, the memoirs of Robert McNamara, and NSA publications from 2005 proved material misinterpretation by the US government to justify a war against Vietnam. The outcome of these two incidents was the passage by Congress of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which granted U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson the authority to assist any Southeast Asian country whose government was considered to be jeopardized by communist aggression. The resolution served as Johnson's legal justification for deploying U.S. conventional forces and the commencement of open warfare against North Vietnam. The same goes for the Gulf War. The Norea testimony was a false testimony given before the Congressional Human Rights Caucus on October 10, 1990, by a 15-year-old girl who provided only her first name, Norea. The testimony was widely publicized and was cited numerous times by United States senators and President George H.W. Bush in their rationale for backing Kuwait in the Gulf War. In 1992, it was revealed that Norea's last name was Al-Aba, and that she was the daughter of Saud al-Sabah, the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. Furthermore, it was revealed that her testimony was organized as part of the Citizens for a Free Kuwait public relations campaign, which was run by the American public relations firm Hill & Knowlton for the Kuwaiti government. Following this, al-Sabah's testimony has come to be regarded as a classic example of modern atrocity propaganda. The same goes for the Iraq War. The uranium forgeries were forged documents initially released in 2001 by SISMI, Italian military intelligence, which seemed to depict an attempt made by Saddam Hussein in Iraq to purchase yellow cake uranium powder from Niger during the Iraq disarmament crisis. Based on these documents and other indicators, the governments of the United States and the United Kingdom asserted that Iraq violated United Nations sanctions against Iraq by attempting to procure nuclear material for the purpose of creating weapons of mass destruction. And wait, it gets better. Operation Northwoods was a proposed false flag operation against the Cuban government that originated within the U.S. Department of Defense, or DoD, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or JCS, of the United States government in 1962. The proposals called for the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, or other U.S. government operatives to commit acts of terrorism against American civilians and military targets, blaming them on the Cuban government and using them to justify a war against Cuba. The possibilities detailed in the document included the possible assassination of Cuban emigres, sinking boats of Cuban refugees in the high seas, hijacking planes, blowing up a U.S. ship, and orchestrating violent terrorism in the U.S. cities. The proposals were rejected by John F. Kennedy. The plan was drafted by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, signed by Chairman Lyman Lemnitzer, and sent to the Secretary of Defense. Although part of the U.S. government's anti-communist Cuban project, Operation Northwoods was never officially accepted. It was authorized by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but then rejected by President John F. Kennedy. According to currently released documentation, none of the operations became active under the auspices of the Operation Northwoods proposals. The fact that the highest levels of Department of Defense and JCS thought that committing terrorist acts against U.S. citizens was an acceptable idea, and that none of these people were jailed for treason, really blows my mind. It makes me wonder what on earth is going through the heads of top brass today. Story 19. The Department of Health and Human Services practiced female sterilization on Native American women all the way through 1970s. It is sobering to know that tax dollars were used to suppress indigenous birth rates less than 50 years ago. Between 25 to 50% of Native women were sterilized against their will, and their birth rate dropped by 3/4 during this time. Black and poor women were also affected. I remember reading a story about a 12-year-old black girl in the South in the 1960s, going to the doctor for an appendectomy and being sterilized without being informed. Many women did not find out for years, until they realized they should have gotten their period by now or were having trouble conceiving. Story 20. To the best of my knowledge, there is a book called The Adam and Eve Story, written by a relatively unknown author named Chan Thomas. Please correct me if I'm mistaken. The book is similar to the works of Charles Hapgood and his theories on Earth crust displacement. However, the crucial difference is that the CIA classified the Adam and Eve story, and it was only recently declassified. Unfortunately, the book was heavily censored before its release, with over 70% of the original content omitted from the declassified version. Even entire pages are missing from earlier chapters without any explanation. After reading the declassified version, one might reasonably wonder, what the hell was in the book that the CIA felt the need to completely hide it from the public until now? And why are they still withholding the majority of its contents? Even though the sanitized version of the book still makes more sense than the works of Charles Hapgood, a lot of what is left in the book sounds far-fetched.